What impact does healthcare have on poverty?
I think it's a big impact. It's an impact that's very difficult to measure. And one of the interesting things that's coming out in poverty research more and more is it's not so much about absolute income. You can't say if you're below X dollar figure, you're poor, and if you're above it, you're not. Volatility in the lives of people that fall into poverty is oftentimes a more important factor. So, for example, healthcare emergencies in this country. I mean, in Massachusetts, things are better than in a lot of states,
Yes.
you know, but something like a third, actually I think it is a third of people who fall into poverty, in and out of poverty on a yearly basis, it's because of a healthcare emergency. They can't pay their medical bills. I mean, and this kind of thing is unthinkable in Europe, where I spent many years as a correspondent and thankfully had 2 children on the state healthcare system there.
Well, I wanted to talk for a moment about Europe's higher spending on social safety nets and how that has bolstered their economy.
Well, we could talk about 2 things on that front, healthcare and education. I think the fact that people have a baseline level of state-funded healthcare means that they don't have these kind of healthcare emergencies that then push them into poverty and become more expensive, because then, of course, you have people going to the emergency room, you have people that need to go on social services, etc. Education, though, is another important factor. When you look at these studies from places like Pew and Brookings that are finding how a number of Western and Northern European countries are now more socially mobile than the U.S., you often find that a big factor is state-funded education. Because, you know, kids here, you can be really smart, but if you're poor, you're stuck, you know? And with the Pell Grants going and, you know, a lot of things making it harder and harder to get education, I think it's going to be a continuing problem.
And if you're born poor, you're much more likely to be sick and malnourished on top of everything else.
Absolutely.
What impact does our tax policy have on the problem of social inequality?
Essentially, I think what we need is a tax system more like the one that you find in Germany or France, which is simpler, okay? I mean, you know, we all know of the hundreds of pages of tax code in this country that make it easy to jump through legal hoops. The rich that have succeeded because of all the opportunities in this country need to pay their fair share. I mean, I think that you need a system in which you're going to have a high consumption tax. So if you're the kind of person that can buy 2 Cadillacs, Mr. Romney, you know, or a jet or a yacht, then you have to pay for them in a way that we don't in this country. I think that you also need to think about systems that really take the burden off of the middle and redistribute to the poor, but in areas that have that are directly touching mobility. Areas like, I would say, education first and foremost, but probably healthcare and a number of other areas as well. Any
other specific ideas on how this nation can create more opportunity?
Many of these things really do focus back on education. It was interesting because Charles Murphy actually today in the New York Times had an interesting op-ed piece about this, in which he talked about not only do we need more technical schools and a kind of a reevaluation of this idea of a 4-year degree from an Ivy League school automatically gets you a job in, you know, this and that and another great company. We need to pay everyone minimum wage, so no more unpaid internships. I mean, you know, I have to say, working in media, which is not a particularly well-paid industry, you see a lot of people that can afford to take on unpaid internships, and then you have a leg up, whereas kids that are not as advantaged have to wait tables or, you know, do things that are not as career advancing. So I think some kind of law, I agree with him, that you need to pay everyone minimum wage regardless of what kind of, you know, starter job they're in. I think a rethinking of trade and technical schools. More collaboration, kind of German style actually, between public sector, private sector, and educators. There's not enough talking, although I think there's starting to be more. I hear more about this in Washington. I think we need, I'm going to use a third rail word here, but sort of industrial policy light, not picking industries that we want to succeed, but getting the public, the private, the educators together to talk about where are their growth opportunities.
It'd be great if more and more cities, municipalities, and companies could get together and do this type of thing.
It would be, and it's the norm elsewhere in the world, so it should be here too.
This excerpt is brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law, the leader of reform in legal education and a leader in multimedia education for the public. To view the full interview and for a full listing of MSL's programs, log on to mslaw.edu.